Yo, what is up everyone? Back here with another video, excuse me. Today we're going to be doing a team building guide. Now, different from my other guides, I want this to be very comprehensive, straightforward, and kind of giving you guys a straight idea of how you want to team build in the format. I'm not going to focus so much on EVs, only because more so what I want to kind of establish for you guys is kind of the main idea of how you construct a team. The EVs are obviously secondary, they're based on different teams, whatever. That's not the point of what I'm trying to get through. There's probably gonna be a separate video on EVing in Sword and Shield and like in GS Cup. So and there are also like other EVing videos out there too that you can check out. So there's what's it called, there's a lot of resources there, but I do want to go over the basic restricted format, like kind of constructions, mostly because in this current format, you'll notice that there's almost a formula, and some people may not notice it, but like it's on a lot of teams, right? I mean, let's say we even open up like this game, right? Like this game pretty much has exactly what I'm talking about in terms of like how the team functions, besides like maybe a couple differences, right? But pretty much when it comes to a restricted format, you'll notice that usually the first thing you choose is going to be your restricted. So let's say, for example, we pick Calyrex Ice, right? And we pick Groudon, right? Now, and this is the interesting part, majority of you who have probably played the format would naturally think, okay, well then next up would probably be Charizard and Venusaur. Well, why is it Charizard and Venusaur? And this is kind of what I'm going to touch on in this video. So pretty much the reason why Charizard and Venusaur are a natural filler on Sun is because they're two really strong Dynamax options that are brought in separate situations, right? Sometimes they're brought together, but majority of the time you have two Dynamax options that are really powering your team up and pretty much like, dealing a bunch of damage, right? Now, this is something that is really interesting. A lot of the time, it's beneficial to use restricteds that do not require your max so that other partners can kind of match the power level of the restricteds with Dynamax, and they can all be used like in tandem to put on a lot of offense, right? So kind of begs the question, like, okay, well, if that's the case, then why are we then why aren't we thinking about Dynamaxing our restricteds? It's not that you can't Dynamax your restricteds, it's just usually nice to have your Dynamax centric options be other Pokemon, right? Typically the formula that I'm seeing on a lot of teams is two restricted, two offensive Dynamax Pokemon, two support Pokemon, right? So like your natural filler for this would be like Mimikyu and Incineroar, right? And the reason why this would be the natural filler is because it does that even if it's like subconsciously, right? Because you have two support, right? You have two Dynamax, and you have two restricted, right? Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad formula, right? This is actually fine. I think it's actually a pretty decent way to build, right? It usually results in a pretty consistent team. For example, right? Let's look at this team, right? Calyrex gives us speed control. It gives us an offensive breaker, pretty much, being able to deal damage. And it's overall bulky, right? It gives you an alternate mode to the team. Groudon serves as weather control, and it serves as setup with Swords Dance, right? And that kind of is its own unique role in itself. Then you have Charizard and Venusaur, who are the offensive breakers. They set damage over time. They offer speed control, both with Chlorophyll for Venusaur alone, and for Charizard with Airstream. And on top of that, Venusaur also has status, right? So you kind of see how the roles are being filled out on a team, right? So it's not just about like the actual two Dynamax Pokemon, two support Pokemon, two restricted. It's kind of about how they fill out those roles and what they do for the team. Then we go to the last two Pokemon, Incineroar and Mimikyu, right? Now, Incineroar offers damage reduction, it offers pivoting with Parting Shot, it offers Fake Out Pressure, and, that's pretty much like the main thing it does. Then you have Mimikyu, which is speed control again, and other support moves that are going to help both your Calyrex power up and your other Pokemon kind of actually be threatening, right? So this is just kind of like an initial, what's it called? Like kind of idea. Give me 2 seconds, sorry, I just need to respond to something. Sorry guys, I don't like to be distracted during the videos. But pretty much you'll notice that it kind of has this set, almost like structure, right? And then from here we'd be like, okay, so now we just kind of fill out the moves. Glacial Lance, High Horsepower, Trick Room, right? Like the actual movesets aren't too complicated, right? Typically what I like to do when I'm team building is get the 6 Pokemon first, and then fill out the items and then the moves, right? In this case, though, it's pretty straightforward, right? Like Citrus Berry, Precipice Blades, Swords Dance, Rock Slide, Protect, right? And then Charizard, you're going to want Life Orb, right? Now, we kind of went over the basic structure of these teams and what everything does, right? But with Charizard and sometimes with certain Pokemon, picking your movesets is going to be very important, right? So you might be like, okay, well, why do we pick Weakness Policy? It has synergy with Shadow Sneak on Mimikyu. Why did we pick Citrus Berry? It just gives Groudon extra bulk, opportunity to set up. Why did we pick Life Orb? Well, mostly because Charizard is getting the benefit off of Solar Power. So it's pretty much just making reasonable choices based on your team and kind of like what's surrounding it, right? Now, you might be like, okay, well, why Ancient Power on Charizard? This is for other Charizard. If you look at your team, the team can struggle to deal with Charizard, so it's important to kind of have an extra option to deal with it in certain situations. Venusaur, right? You're like, okay, well, what do I want a Venusaur? Well, because the Life Orb's taken up, you're going to be using Leaf Storm, Earth Power, Weather Ball, Sleep Powder, right? And pretty much the idea here is just having a bulky support Pokemon that's able to set damage over time, different from Charizard, whereas Charizard is based more around dealing damage. So you guys can kind of see like how a general team idea is kind of made, right? I did go through it pretty quickly because, you know, obviously this is something that comes to you more naturally, I think, as you play the game. But like it's pretty straightforward, right? And like teams like these are very safe, and that's not a bad thing, right? Like having a safe team, safe team. Oh my god, I can't speak. Isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? The thing is that you just have to understand like how they're constructed and how they're utilized. So something like this is obviously a very standard 6, and it's going to be strong because it has a lot of different options, right? And you'll see that with like the other teams we'll go over, right? Let's just do another one. So starting off the same way, right? I'll pick a random restricted just to show you guys kind of how it works, right? Let's see, what restricted do we want to do? Okay, let's say Yveltal and Zacian, for example, right? So on this team, you might notice that, what's it called? You have 2 restricteds. One isn't using Dynamax for sure, right? And Yveltal is a Dynamax that is a Dynamax option that can be used, right? So it kind of depends on how you want to construct your team. That being said, majority of the time on teams like these, it's nice to have some sort of offensive max option, as I mentioned. So typically, usually on each team, have 2 Dynamax options that are like always want to max or like almost all the time want to max. And then you have 2 optionals, right? And like those are usually just like nice optional ones to have. It's not necessarily required. It's just like a way, it's like an approach you can take, right? So for example, let's go look at this team, right? Similar concept. We're going to start off with our 2 restricteds. Now, with this core, you'll typically see stuff like Colossal, right? So Colossal is obviously a really strong Dynamax option. It's usually the thing you want to be maxing, right? And pretty much the main idea behind Colossal is getting it set up with Urshifu, right? So pretty much you'll notice all of these teams have a very similar construction in terms of how they're made. So they'll usually include some sort of defensive cores and a variety of roles, or they'll just like kind of have a decent type balance. So I'll go back to this for an example, right? You have fire and grass as a core. They cover each other's weaknesses, obviously, right? The only reason why you're not running water here is because, you know, it doesn't really work too well with sun. Then you have Calyrex here, right? Calyrex weak to fire moves. You have a lot of fire resists, right? You have Groudon, who's weak to ice moves, which you have a resist with your own Calyrex, right? And it's weak to water moves, which you have Sun and Venusaur to deal with, right? And then if you are worried about Calyrex Shadow, who is super effective versus your Calyrex, you have like Incineroar and Mimikyu with Disguise, right, to kind of sit in front of it. So it just kind of gives you guys a good example of how it can be incredibly disruptive, I guess, to opposing Pokemon, right? Because you have like a really good defensive backbone along with having a really solid offensive kind of pressure, and like that's kind of what you're aiming for when you're team building in this format, right? Having the mix between both. And like it's similar in this team, right? Pretty much with like this team, you're focused around having a more offensive backbone with some like defense, or not offensive backbone. You're focused on having offensive options combined with like some defensive options, right? So Rillaboom and Incineroar are more so your defensive core, pretty much giving you the option of fake out cycling, giving you the option of U-turn, parting shot, pivoting, right? And then Urshifu exerting the offensive pressure that you need without necessarily needing max. Well, you might be like, okay, well, didn't you say you usually want 2 Pokemon? Well, the nice thing here is that on this team, Yveltal would actually end up being the max, right? If you guys want access to this full team, this is up on the Patreon, but the whole point of this video is to just kind of give you guys an idea of like how certain teams are constructed, right? You'll see here that pretty much Behemoth Blade, Swords Dance, Play Rough, Protect, right? With these 2 coverages, you pretty much can deal with everything that would give Colossal trouble, right? And by having the Max Yveltal option, it gives you access to unique mode that you wouldn't otherwise have. Now, pretty much what you can do with this kind of Yveltal is you can run Max Airstream next to Zacian, Urshifu, Rillaboom, or Incineroar, right? And it gives you a different mode from the Colossal mode, which is obviously focused around getting the Colossal set up and dealing damage that way. So it's kind of unique in that regard. And the nice thing too, and this is kind of something related to the actual move sets of Pokemon, when you're picking moves, you usually want to think about overall what your team is weak to versus not weak to. So the reason why I'd pick Play Rough on this team is because if you look, we don't really have much to hit Palkia, right? The best we can do is hit it neutrally until we run Play Rough on Zacian. So having something like Play Rough for Palkia is actually incredibly useful in this team, and also just for other dragon types, right? So that's just kind of to give you an idea of how these things kind of function, or like kind of how you decide on moves and like Dynamax options, teams. Like it's very straightforward, right? But like sometimes people miss like how like what it takes to actually build these teams, right? Like you'll notice like after the explanation, it seems pretty basic, right? But like this is a skill that a lot of people like I guess sometimes need help with or like don't understand. And that's not a bad thing, you know what I mean? Like that's just how it is. But once you can start seeing these things in teams, it'll just help you construct teams easier and also just know how to approach team building earlier in a format, right? Building around consistent options that you know can do well. Having a certain structure that can allow you to build consistent teams that can do well, right? And you'll notice here, right, like I said, 2 Dynamax options. The exception here is that Zacian can't Dynamax, right? So kind of like you know, obviously like different dynamic there, but these two are optional maxes that can actually work in certain situations, right? So these are two maxes that can work, so it kind of compensates for the lack of max from Zacian and how Yveltal is always going to want the max, right? You have 2 extra optional maxes here. So that's pretty much filling it. I would normally advise sticking with only 2 Pokemon that like really need to max to get their value, because the issue is once you have more Pokemon that need a max to get their value, you kind of have a team that like there's always going to be one Pokemon on the team who is going to want max that doesn't have it, right? You always want to make sure that your options are flexible and you're not locking yourself into a team where like multiple things want the max, only one can have it, and then you have a slot that's basically not helping you at all, right? Usually the best for teams are teams that can have a lot of Pokemon that do like max but also can function without it. But there are obviously some exceptions to that. So you guys will kind of see same kind of idea, right? This is kind of how we approached it. Now, I'll do one last example to show you guys kind of how the teams function. So pretty much, if we were to now take a Kyogre team, right? Let's look at the maybe Swordfish archetype, because that's like a really common one too. I almost wrote in Sword, right? Pretty much it kind of fills in the main idea of like the teams that we had been mentioning, right? So they start out, they have two restricteds, right? Kyogre is a potential max, right? It's not something that's always going to be maxing, right? Then you usually want 2 really strong offensive max options, right? And those are typically Tornadus, right? Because it gives you the Tornogre mode, not Defiant, Prankster. And then typically you'll see that the other partner that's very common is Regieleki. Now these are both potential Dynamax Pokemon. However, the unique thing about this specific team is that Regieleki doesn't need the max all the time because you usually run Sash on it, right? Then you have 2 support Pokemon, right, that kind of fill in the team and you know, kind of support it in a good way, right? And you'll notice not all teams have this, particularly some teams don't usually have this, but a lot of teams like to incorporate typing cores that work well together. So for example, on this team, you'll see Incineroar, Amoonguss, Kyogre, Fire, Water, Grass. On Colossal, you'll see Fire, Water, Grass, right? And then you'll have like the Yveltal Zacian synergy where like they both cover each other's weaknesses pretty much. But yeah, that's like the main idea there. And again, as I mentioned, you know, you have to decide your movesets relative to your team composition, right? So let's take Kyogre here, right? Obviously, you're going to want Water Spout, right? You're going to want Origin Pulse, you're going to want Ice Beam, and you're going to want Protect. And then you go to Zacian. Again, this team doesn't have much to break dragons, so you're probably going to be running the Play Rough Zacian that's a little bit more optimized to deal with those things, right? Whereas, like, maybe on a team where you have Sun already, right? Or you have just something that can snipe a dragon type, you might be running a different move on the Zacian, right? But Play Rough is honestly the better Zacian option, it seems like, from what I've played. But yeah, and then you'll see, like, obviously Tornadus with the standard options, right? Having a strong Dynamax mode, and then Regieleki kind of having that strong support option, along with having a potential max option, because it just benefits from the electric moves, electric terrain, and everything, right? And, like, you'll see that it's very straightforward, right? Like, there's not too much I guess there's not too much complicatedness to like restricted format building. The one thing that is important to recognize is that these builds are based around consistency. If people know what you're using, it shouldn't make a difference, but that means that you're going to have to play up to the standard of the team, right? So for example, right, a team like this, or a team constructed in the conventional way that I've been mentioning, pretty much is centered around consistency, right? And it's based around your consistency as a player, your ability to play the team consistently and meet the standard at which the team is trying to get you to be at, right? But when you use this simple building style, you'll notice that it's pretty intuitive, right? I'd say, and we'll go over all the teams one more time to kind of make sure that you guys get it. But basically, you'll notice that on this team, two forms of speed control outside of Trick Room, so that we're not, obviously just outsped and rely on Trick Room totally. Weather control, damage reduction, right? Status between Venusaur's Sleep Powder and Mimikyu's Will-O-Wisp. We have Safeguard to protect ourselves from status. And we also have enough speed control with, like, Chlorophyll Venusaur, and we have Airstream from Charizard, right? And Trick Room. Second team, you'll notice speed control with Yveltal. You're able to go for Airstreams, right? With Colossal, you can side Aqua Jet it. So similar to Venusaur's Chlorophyll, it's an individual speed boost, but it does centralize the game around the Colossal. You'll see that we have setup options with Zacian, right? Covers for our weaknesses with the Dragon types, right? And then we have the Fire, Water, Grass defensive core, and we have two offensive Pokemon, one that synergizes with Colossal and one that also works in Airstream next to Yveltal. And then you have Incineroar as the backbone of the team to go for Intimidates and kind of disrupt the opposing team. Then Swordfish still fits the same thing. We have speed control with Tornadus. We have a Pokemon that helps in Trick Room along with the defensive backbone here. We have speed control also with Regieleki going for Electrowebs. We have setup with Zacian, also helps us deal with the Dragon type weakness. And then we have a Kyogre, which can obviously click spread moves and kind of acts as our breaker along with Zacian to deal a bunch of damage. Now, you'll notice that these teams range in terms of how aggressive they are. I feel like with this team is still aggressive, but it's a little bit more defensive. Whereas like these two are focused on like consistently putting offense on your opponent. I think in this format, you're going to find a lot of success with bulky offense, teams that can exert a lot of pressure every single turn. And that's something that you guys should be looking out for and kind of aiming for, right? Zygarde is interesting. I've tested it a bunch. It's kind of constructed uniquely to the other restricteds, so it's something I'm going to touch on in another video, but yeah, that's kind of the general idea of like how these restricted pairs are made and kind of how the teams work. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys. I know this is a little bit different than my normal team building guides. I wanted to point out this particular trend and kind of idea because I feel like with team building guides, sometimes you can get too focused on the smaller nuanced things, such as like EVs and kind of the movesets and everything, whereas it's actually related to the initial 6 Pokemon you make, then those sets come along with that, right? Like, once you practice enough, you have the natural intuition to actually approach team building in a unique way, right? Or like in a way that like you can contextualize all this without having to sit in front of the builder for hours, right? I always think the best testing and the best way to know if you have a good team is through playing. And playing will always give you more information than sitting there and theorying, right? And like that's why I just like bringing teams after I build them in the tournaments as opposed to like playing ladder and stuff, because ladder can really, like bog you down, or like you can play something random that you'll never play in tournament. It'll like mess with you. And when you play games in tournaments in best of 3, it really helps you kind of contextualize this and see if you're doing it right or if you're doing it wrong, right? But I know I went through this pretty quickly. I usually touch on this a little bit more in depth during my coaching sessions, and also on Patreon you guys will see access to a bunch of other teams. Well, more rental codes coming out soon as well, and like some other guides that I'm going to be putting out. But once again, guys, thank you for all the support. I incredibly appreciate it. If there's anything that you would have liked me to talk about in this video that I did not, make sure to let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure to obviously take that, I guess, criticism, constructive criticism, whatever, and try and include it in the next video that I do on this topic. So once again, guys, thank you for all the support. I incredibly appreciate it, and I will see you guys on the next video. Peace.